Professor Nam Yong-lee's long commentary, even if the Korean government prints more money, Korea will pay the price in inflation before growth, money supply and real growth are largely neutral. Korea must break the illusion of monetary omnipotence. Whenever the economy shakes, the government repeatedly leans on expanding the money supply. Yet, money is not an engine of growth. It is pressure that changes economic choices through credit conditions and price signals. When policymakers raise that pressure, productivity stays the same, while prices and debt move first. As of 2025, Korea's broad money, M2, cash plus demand deposits plus time and savings deposits plus market-type instruments, etc., has repeatedly been confirmed in the 4,400 billion won range. If the liquidity stock has grown this large, and the growth rate still cannot structurally break higher, the policy focus must move away from printing more money and toward where the money actually flows. A strong criticism is warranted of the Lee Jae-myung government's policy of abusing monetary expansion. Repeating monetary expansion is the easiest excuse for postponing structural reform. It offers the public comforting words about saving the economy, but in reality it shifts the burden of inflation and interest costs onto ordinary citizens. The macro data reveal the limits of Korea's growth. Korea's real GDP, gross domestic product growth, was about 1.4% in 2023 and about 2.0% in 2024. In 2025, quarterly growth has been observed swinging to 0.0% in Q1, 0.6% in Q2, and 1.8% in Q3, consistent with a persistent low growth trend rather than a durable acceleration. The real problem appears when the pace of money growth separates from the pace of real growth. When the money stock expands but the trend in real growth weakens, excess liquidity is more likely to rush into prices and leverage, debt, than into production. This is a typical pattern repeatedly seen in aging, mature economies. For that reason, the claim that printing money creates growth is, in Korea's recent phase, a political slogan rather than a proven law. If the true bottlenecks are productivity, demographics, regulatory costs, and industrial competitiveness, expanding the money supply cannot break those bottlenecks. In general, monetary expansion shows up in inflation first. Korea experienced a high inflation episode in July 2022 when consumer price inflation reached 6.3%. That figure shows how quickly inflation can squeeze daily life when liquidity expansion overlaps with supply shocks. Inflation looked as if it was calming down afterward, but the story is not over. In November 2025, the Consumer Price Index stood around 117.2, 2020 equals 100, and was reported to be up 2.4% year on year. If core inflation, excluding food and energy, is around 2.0%, that implies a structure in which perceived living cost inflation does not fall easily. Stated bluntly, the idea of shaking the price level once and catching it later is irresponsible. When inflation rises, wage bargaining and price setting change. If expectations harden, tighter policy becomes necessary, and the ultimate cost is borne by households, firms, and the self-employed. Labour market indicators can create an illusion. In November 2025, figures such as about 29.046 million employed persons, a year-on-year increase of 225,000, and an unemployment rate of 2.2% can look stable on the surface. If the employment rate for ages 15 to 64 is in the 70% range, it becomes easier to say things are fine. Yet employment holding up is not the same as living conditions improving. When interest burdens and housing costs are high, real consumption does not expand even with jobs, and the lived reality of domestic demand and self-employment can worsen. It is dangerous to cover up the side effects of monetary policy with employment headcounts alone. Policy judgment must shift from "there are jobs so we can print more" to "even with jobs, Why is real lived experience so poor? A lesson widely observed over the long history of modern monetary regimes is that money supply does not reliably raise real economic growth. In Korea as well, expanding the money supply does not create jobs so much as it changes inflation and financial conditions. The stakeholder groups connected to money supply include the Bank of Korea, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, the National Assembly, the Financial Services Commission, the Financial Supervisory Service, banks and non-bank financial institutions, corporations, households, labor, and the media and expert communities. They form a network of mutual pressure and influence and understand the consequences that money expansion can trigger. In that network, monetary expansion tends to shake expectations, asset prices, lending competition, and price pass-through before it raises real output. Decisions made by institutions with large authority immediately change prices and lending terms, and those changes transmit into households' repayment burdens and firms' investment decisions. If credit flows into real estate and financial assets rather than productive investment, inflation and asset prices rise before growth. When this relationship is ignored, the same policy cycle repeats, easing in crises, tightening after inflation rises, the weakest groups collapsing first during tightening, and political pressure pushing for renewed easing until the vicious cycle hardens. Authority and responsibility must be matched precisely. The Bank of Korea holds authority over the policy rate, benchmark interest rate, and liquidity management, and therefore bears responsibility for price stability and financial stability. If the policy rate declined from 3.25% in October 2024 to 2.50% in May 2025, then the responsibility to manage expectations by clearly stating the pace of easing and the exit conditions becomes heavier. The government and the National Assembly have the authority and responsibility to strengthen the foundations of productivity through fiscal policy, regulation, and industrial, labor, and education policy. The moment they try to cover structural bottlenecks with money, a structure emerges that shifts responsibility onto the central bank, while the cost is ultimately pushed onto the public through inflation and debt. Financial authorities and the financial sector hold de facto allocation power over where credit goes. If rules such as the DSR, debt service ratio, the share of income devoted to principal and interest payments across all loans, are loosened or supervision falls behind, finance becomes not a channel for innovation, but an amplifier of bubbles. Scientific statistical verification must be demanded more strongly. If strong co-movement was observed between real broad money growth and real per capita income growth in the 1971 to 2017 period, that fact should be acknowledged. At the same time, concluding from that result that money-created growth is a statistical misreading, because in an era when high growth and financial deepening ran together, reverse causality in the direction of growth, credit expansion, money growth can operate powerfully. Therefore, additional statistical tests are necessary. Structural break dummies, variables that mark regime changes or shocks as 0/1, should separate discontinuities such as the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, and the pandemic. Impulse response analysis using a VAR, vector autoregression, jointly estimating interactions among multiple variables, or a VECM, vector error correction model incorporating long-run equilibrium relationships, is needed to move closer to causality. Beyond money aggregates alone, pathway variables such as the policy rate, household debt, housing prices, credit spreads, the difference between corporate yields and government bond yields, and the exchange rate must be included to decompose where the money flows. If policymakers stop tracking the numbers to the end and instead jump to slogans, policy becomes propaganda. In the end, the true remedy for Korea's economic distress is not money but productivity improvement. First, monetary policy must be a policy of credibility, not popularity. Even when liquidity is supplied in crises, exit conditions and normalization paths must be made explicit so that markets do not learn the lesson that they will always bail us out. Second, a macroprudential policy mix is needed to block the channel through which credit floods into asset markets. The focus must shift from loan volumes to repayment capacity and risk concentration, and financial institutions must be evaluated for soundness rather than for loan growth. Third, the core of growth policy must be executed outside money. Predictable regulation, fair competition, investment in research and development, talent development, fixing labor education mismatches, and stabilizing energy and supply chains determine real income. Printing money is easy, but the price of that ease is ultimately paid by the public through inflation and debt, and that fact must no longer be ignored. Ordinary households, small and venture businesses, and the self-employed must not be pushed into deeper hardship. Thank you for watching Professor Nam Yong Lee's long commentary.